Perfect. Thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to all of the Queer and Classical team for inviting us and just letting us talk. So I'm going to start off just with a short introduction.
Wipe it down.
How do you click it? Next slide. There you go. So just wanted to start off by talking about the fact that why we're decolonizing queerness, because the concepts, categories, and language that we use today are formed by our origin stories. Could you go back, please? Thank you. Namely because the classical canon itself that we often look at contains queer stories, and these are the ones that we focus on, with figures such as Achilles, Sappho, Apollo and Hyacinthus, Mark Antony, and Alexander the Great. These are all really popular topics when you're studying queerness within antiquity. And it's really nice when people take these topics and look at them in comparison with different receptions around the world, but we think that we want to go beyond that. And we don't want to limit the definition of classics with queerness within Greco-Roman antiquity, because this limits the view of different origins of queerness across the world. And we found that the lack of visibility of queer people of colour and their origin stories has been used to claim that these origin stories and these people don't exist, which is why we wanted to talk about it today. If you could flip onto the next slide, please. We wanted to first kind of say that modern conceptions of queerness won't directly translate onto ancient expressions of sexuality and gender, and also we'll be talking about lots of different types of cultures today, so these concepts will vary between different cultures. We also wanted to flag up the term of me-search. Both Will and I are queer people of colour, and we don't shy away from this idea of researching something that is part of your own identity. We don't think that this detracts from the scholarship that you're providing. And we also want to acknowledge that we're both undergraduate students and want to kind of ensure that you don't view us as like we are speaking as kind of great scholars. We're just trying to promote kind of beginnings of conversations about decolonization and queerness within classics, and we encourage our audience to research beyond our talks. Thank you. So first off, I wanted to talk about why we're seeking the origins of queerness within mythology, which is why I'm going to start off, because mythology itself expresses notions which are accepted or believed within a culture, the records of which may have been manipulated by the authors that transmit them to us, but we have a reason to believe that there are underlying kind of reasons within these stories and underlying messages. The reason that I see that we seek queer myths to prove our origins existed before these historical records emerged, or to kind of explore stories that we can kind of attach to our own identities. And we seek myths because history has gaps. The problem is that some mythology has greater record and greater research than others and has been brought to light differently. Mythological characters such as Achilles have been transformed through contemporary historical fiction into being queer icons or symbols, but not every queer icon has the same privilege. We want to argue that the colonial erasure of people of colour from these queer myths can retract from many lenses. On the one hand, anthropological sources tell us about pervasive stereotypes. For example, something I found was that third world women were victims, shackled to their marriage beds with no agency, and thus could not participate within kind of queer relationships. Another reason why QPOC origin myths aren't visible is because definitions of queerness were lost in translation through Indigenous tongues. And additionally, just homosexuality, when it was present, was demonized through colonialism. And through us finding QPOC myths, we can track queerness across cultures, which is why we're exploring it today. Flip to the next slide. I wanted to first start off by talking about Gita Thadrani's Sakyani. It's one of my favorite texts that I've been reading recently, and it essentially illustrates how something can be interpreted as a lesbian cosmogony, which was essentially erased within the Rig Veda. So to start off, the generic feminine form was often expressed as the plural in Sanskrit, in something that we call the dual feminine. So linguistically in Indology, Yava, which is the term that I'll be talking about, which is on the screen, was translated as Sky Father in the Rig Veda. You could compare this to Deus in Latin or Theos in ancient Greek. But Dyava derives from the root word Dyaval, which is also on the screen here. Its root is Dyu, which means light, but the kind of ending, the AU ending, is the dualized feminine. So the move from the Dyaval to the Dyava is an expression of the dual as one unit. So when we're talking about this god of origin, we're talking about a dual feminine deity as one unit. According to the author, textual evidence within the Rig Veda illustrates that the dual feminine can be interpreted as lesbian. I want to point just onto the slide, which talks about the dual cosmogony representing a holistic feminine union, whereby the twins of Dyaval can be seen as lovers or mothers or sisters. These kind of dual mothers are implicated in a feminine kinship genealogy. They are seen as the first parents, they are seen as creators. And so the erotic and sexual are implicit in the fusional intimacy of their bonding. So things like darkness and light, stillness and movement, they're different states of being constellated in a circular frame. So yeah, so that was one of the kind of examples of basically lesbian creation myths. I want to move on and talk a little bit about different kind of creator gods and our definitions of queerness. I want to say that not all of these deities are ancient within the standard definition of what we call classics, but they have a kind of similar theme to them, and I'll kind of focus on the great goddess of Teotihuacan from Mesoamerica. So firstly, talking about the Dahomey Kingdom, which is now Benin. So there were two twin creator gods called Mawu and Lisa. They combined to become the androgynous creator god Mawu Lisa, which supposedly created the world within 4 days, including plants and animals and humans. This is a concept that has parallels elsewhere. For example, in Chinese mythology, the primordial woman sometimes combined in her person the masculine yang and the feminine yin. So we again have this idea of two interacting forces that sustain the cosmos. I want to now move on to, sorry, some water, to trace genderqueer elements of the Mesoamerican antiquity up until the Aztec Empire. Since we have a lot of the evidence within the Aztec Empire, it's a much later period of time, so we have more evidence. I will discuss this, but in relation to early antiquity, by way of the continuity hypothesis, first suggested by Saville in 1929, which argues that Olmec deities from Mesoamerica, which existed up until roughly 400 BCE, they were forerunners of later Mesoamerican gods, so we can trace a lineage here, which links what would have been Olmec deities to like Aztec gods as well. I'm going to first talk about the great goddess of Teotihuacan, or known as the Spider Woman, who was a proposed, some would say goddess, of the pre-Columbian civilization in what is now Mexico. She was great. She was thought to be a goddess of the underworld, darkness, earth, water, war, and possibly even creation itself, but has been dubbed as female only by their association with water. And according to Mandel, you could argue that they're a mixed gender figure. If you have a look at the image on the screen, you might be able to see this through different kind of attributions of what they're wearing, and I'll go into that in a couple minutes. But essentially the argument is that they are a mixed gender figure based on the notion that gender is socially and culturally constructed, and that Western models of the gender binary shouldn't be opposed on non-Western figures. There is a history of mixed gender identity within the Mesoamerican people, and considering that the goddess is from Teotihuacan, Western models of the gender binary shouldn't be imposed. And there are no explicit sexual characteristics shown on the Great Goddess, which you can see from the image. There is a history of masculine and feminine attributes being shown within the same figure, within different images of Mesoamerican art. So Mandel references many depictions of male and female deities, which suggests that it's impossible to gender this deity based on like the headdress, the fact that there are zigzags, and the fact that there is a nose bar. And all of these different kind of like gendered characteristics illustrate that you cannot pinpoint one single gender onto this deity. Furthermore, I wanted to talk about the dichotomies in like Western worlds. We have this idea that there is a good and an evil dichotomy. Something can be positive, something can be negative. Within Mesoamerica, this idea was that there was chaos and there was order, and so you were continually seeking balance. This idea of balance between genders, not having one which is on the one side and one on the other, which also kind of purports this idea of the fact that this deity would be something in between, and the fact that some scholars have like attributed a gender to them which might not be the gender that they were. I wanted to talk a little bit about Ometeotl, who was the Aztecs' original creator deity, composed of two other deities, again, who were combined together, one male deity and one female deity. They were both, again, good and evil, light and darkness, fire and water. They were also the god of duality, and the source of the universe. And interestingly, and I won't go too much into this because I know the Aztec pantheon is more medieval, but I've left a link on the screen if you're interested. Interestingly, many scholars have claimed that they didn't exist, and I find that really interesting. I don't go into detail there, so you can have a look if you're interested. Another example is the Maya maize deity, which if you think about the importance of maize or corn within Mesoamerican kind of culture, this idea that maize or corn has the ability to switch between the two biological sexes. The Mesoamerican people considered themselves to be descendants of the corn plant, and this nature-based culture allows for the ambiguity of sex and gender within the peoples. So we have evidence that the maize gods inspired Maya elites, no matter their gender, to wear mixed gender costumes to honor the maize god. Another population was the indigenous Wollongal population in northwestern Australia. They had this god called Ungud, who was a snake god who was sometimes male and sometimes female. They were associated with rainbows and fertility. And in the beginning, when only the sky and the earth existed, they lived underground as a giant python. And at night time, they created living beings through their dreams. I'm gonna finish on another story from Japan, which I think will nicely lead into Will's bit. So just talking about Iwata Junichi, who carried out some research on the history and the literature of homoeroticism within Japan. Iwata used the Tokugawa period word nanshoku, which is the compound for the words male and sexual love, almost exclusively in reference to this topic. So he attempted to refute this perception that homosexuality was a foreign practice brought in from China. So he found that in the Nihon Shoki, he found evidence of the origins. I'll talk about that in a second. What I find the most interesting is the quote on the screen, which he's written himself, which in the Nihon Nanshoku, which is the text that he wrote, he says that it is difficult or almost impossible to search for origins. If we insist on finding this, we will end up in the worlds of legends and oral tradition, which takes us far from our own reality. However, he says that, like, even if traditions seem to be unbelievable events, there might be something of historical value in these traditions. So he looks into the Nihon Shoki, which is sometimes translated as the Chronicles of Japan, and you've got an image of what the text would look like. This was written in 200 AD. It's an elaborate, detailed text which has Japanese creation myth, explaining the origin of the world, and the first 7 generations of divine beings. So it's essentially a mythological text, and it has the first record of what we would call male homosexuality, which was between Shino no Hafori and Amo no Hafori, who were 2 good friends. But when the first died of sickness, Amo no Hafori wept greatly and said, while he was alive, we were very intimate friends. Why should we not have the same grave? So he was asked for them to both be buried in the same tomb. Yeah, that is the end of kind of my part. It was just that the history of Japanese homosexuality also begins with a mythic tradition, and I'll pass on to Will now.
Great. Thank you, Rena. Thank you. Really good. Okay, where are we? Yes. So, mythologized history. I'd like to start with a few basic premises. Number 1, queer people exist and have always existed. I would hope that this crowd accepts that as a premise. I really think it would take a long time to explain otherwise, so I'm going to assume you're all on board with that and move on to number 2. In the Greco-Roman world, we have well-known, clear, written evidence for queerness, and I put up Catullus 48 as quite a short poem. It shows a clear romantic attraction towards a man named Juventius. This is my own translation, by the way. I just thought I'd plug that. Stylistically, it's very similar to the famous kissing poem he wrote to Lesbia, Let us live, Lesbia, that one. I think it's very hard to refute that this shows romantic attraction towards another man. And as a result, we can look at moments like these and say, here are queer people, they exist, they have always existed. But the problem lies in moving away from the Greco-Roman world, where it gets a bit trickier. When Greco-Roman queerness is discussed, it's either accepted or rejected. And by that, I mean either people accept queer people exist, or they look at the text and decide, I'm not going to talk about this to people, I'm not going to teach it to people. Or when they translate it incorrectly, they change around pronouns, they change around genders, so the poems all seem heteronormative. You really have one or the other with these texts, because they're very hard to interpret differently unless you're trying to be incorrect. The problem lies with civilizations that tend to show or tend to have remains of an archaeological nature. I will be looking primarily at ancient Egypt throughout all its periods in this presentation. I put forward that scholars have ignored potential queerness, either intentionally or not, in these cultures, presented history outside Greece and Rome as unqueer. Queerness has been minimalized in the ancient world to the level that it's really no more than myth. And by that I mean, all they will say is that, no, you've heard wrong. They weren't actually queer. They were just family members. You have remembered it incorrectly. This is what actually happened. History has been mythologized, and that's how I link it to the title of this seminar. And now on to examples. Nianchnamen and Khnumhotep, right? 5th dynasty Egypt, Old Kingdom, 25th century BCE. To put that into context, this is 21st century. In 400 years, we will be in the 25th century. Then you have to go back double that to get to where these people lived. It's a very long time ago, way before what most people will consider classics in the Greco-Roman sense. We have a tomb, Mastaba tomb, which is one of the older types of tombs in Egypt. It's essentially a little brick building in the deserts for 2 royal manicurists that depict them as very close. They appear 30 times each, more or less, an equal number of depictions for both men, interestingly. And their wives and families appear 3 and 4 times respectively. If you're wondering why one wife only appears 3 times, it's because one image of her has been plastered over in one of the paintings. The key thing to know about these 2 people is they're considered the origins of homosexuality, or at least the first homosexual couple in history. Obviously, that's not true. I mean, the chances that there were a queer couple before them is almost 100%. But this is one of the earliest records we have of queer people actually existing. And yet people say they're twins. That's what they say, because how else should we read into this? There's no writing in the tomb that says they're in a relationship, so why can't they be family? People will say they look the same, so they must be identical twins. People will say they had wives, so they must be heterosexual. This is how they are depicted. You will notice that they are so close, they are almost touching lips. On the left is a reconstruction of the painting on the right. Obviously, the painting on the right is harder to see. This is one of the problems we have with ancient Egyptian art. It is not well preserved. That's fair enough. It's very, very old, and it wasn't, covered by a volcano. It just existed in the desert. We can forgive that sort of erosion, which is why you have to work on recreation sometimes. You'll notice that they are embracing, they are holding each other. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you can, but I'm circling a moment where one holds the other's arm. This is quite a typical depiction of romantic embrace in Old Kingdom tomb art, 5th dynasty tomb art to be exact. And while it's not found everywhere, it has been found a few times depicting heterosexual couples. And here we have it with 2 men, and you'll notice that neither of them has a wife anywhere nearby. That way you will. Here are 2 paintings. This one on the left, I want to bring up because they're so close. Their belts are almost touching. Definitely doesn't seem straight. And then the same on the right here. Which I'll do and just ask you a rhetorical question. Do they look identical? Do they look exactly the same? It's been many years and a lot of the paint has gone away. And even then, not quite sure they do. But whenever you read an article about these 2 people, they always bring up the same thing. They bring up this word. It's a word people use for them. It means brother. If you go more specific, it can mean twin. There are a few problems with this. The first one is this potential metaphorical use of the word. I've quoted Reves here, 2003. They note that the words can be used for brother or sibling, but it also has a metaphorical use of brother in, we might say, the found family aspect, in the way that you might call a very close friend a brother, and also in the way that you might call a lover your family. There is no reason that using this word to describe people would automatically make them platonic friends. And the other issue is that people have been using this word to prove, conclusively prove, I say in quotation marks, that this is a couple of brothers or very close friends who decided to be buried in a tomb together while depicting themselves embracing each other in 30 pieces of artwork. The word never appears in the tomb, not once. Now, fair point, tomb was looted. No one knows when. All the tombs were looted, more or less. So we don't know if there's some obscure artifact in a museum somewhere that no one's identified that tells us they are brothers for a fact, or tells us that they are lovers for a fact. We don't have that, so we can't make that judgment. And yet people are still ascribing this relationship, this word to these people. And before I move on, I just want to point out that the tomb is very similar to heterosexual couples' tombs found in the same area, similar depictions in paintings. No conclusive evidence to say that they were brothers over anything else. Next one. This one is much simpler. It's a small statue, 18th dynasty, 1480 BCE. For those keeping track, that is before all the ancient Greek myths start, if you were to put them on a historical timeline. And this can be found in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy. I will read out the inscription if I can. Can I move this?
Yeah.
That's not what I meant. Okay, you know what? You can read the inscription.
No, you can read it. I'm going to
Brilliant, thank you. This is why we have two screens up. It's very helpful.
Okay.
Yes, to Osiris, Lord of eternity, that he may give every good and pure thing, and the pleasant breeze of the north wind to the car, which means salt, of the lady of the house, Edet, justified. Two things I'd like to bring to your attention: lady of the house and the name Edet. This is one woman saying it to the other, calling the other lady of the house. It doesn't really sound that straight, particularly when you realize that this inscription is repeated twice, one from Edet to Ruyu and one from the other way around. They say this to each other on a statue that depicts them sitting next to each other, embracing, holding arms. Now, I hear what you might be thinking. They're just friends or they're just sisters. Come on, that was a great moment. There we go. Here are three statues. I would like you all to note the same pose in all three statues. There are two straight couples here, and I don't think anyone is going to deny that these are couples. I think looking at these statues, they're pretty obviously a romantic pairing, and scholarship, while often in French for these artifacts for some reason, tends to, and I can't read French, but from what I've tried to understand, they all agree that the ones on the left and the right are couples, particularly this one on the right here, which has a young child. I'm not going to suggest to you that these are just two friends and a random baby. That doesn't make, I don't know why you'd make a statue of that. I'd like to point out that finally, if you were to Photoshop the men out and add the women into this, it would look pretty similar. I don't think there's any real remarkable difference that will let you say that the middle one is just platonic. I think you really probably should be reanalyzing your thoughts if that's all you read into it. Final bit, I've talked a lot about people in the context of their queerness and how that's been systematically ignored and mythologized. And I'd like to turn to one of the more interesting pharaohs out there, Akhenaten, 18th dynasty, New Kingdom. So this is sort of relatively recent. and I say relatively recent because 18th dynasty is still quite a bit before any of the other classics things we tend to talk about. Akhenaten as a person is really, really interesting because for no apparent reason, they seem to have upended everything about Egyptian society. They are a monotheist. They worship the sun disk, the Aten, the literal embodiment of the sun. It's the one you see on Ra's crown. He's a hawk-headed god. He's got the big circle above his head. That's what he worships, the sun disk. He decides to move the capital city of Egypt from the fertile Nile into the middle of the desert and builds the city of Amarna there, primarily because it's got direct access to the sun. And any pictures of the ruins show that there are great vistas where you can see the sky. Really beautiful place, really hot. And the move, along with the closure of all the temples to the other gods, makes the Egyptian priesthood so mad, so angry, and crashes the Egyptian economy so much that by the time Akhenaten dies, their name is tarnished. They're called the heretic king, and they're seemingly lost to history. There are talks that we might have found their mummy, but that is inconclusive at best. We don't know for sure. The saddest thing about Akhenaten is that they, as a person, have sort of been relegated to history, but the members of their family have lived on in fame. They were married to Nefertiti. I do not need to say that she's well known, and this was their son. I hope I don't need to tell you who that is, but I will. It's Tutankhamun. He's very famous. Would you believe it? Tutankhamun, interesting enough, changed his name from Tutankhaten to fit with the re-establishment of ancient Egyptian religion. Why do I bring this up? Akhenaten, aside from all this sort of really fascinating history stuff, depicts themselves like this. I will note that other depictions of pharaohs tend to be hypermasculine, and Akhenaten, who you can see here on the right, has breasts and wider hips than other male figures depicted in the same art style, and quite similar depictions to this woman here, who is assumed to be Nefertiti in some depictions, although it could be another priestess for all we know. This statue on the right shows the same body type. It's hard to see because of the crossed arms, but they have got more traditionally feminine breasts under there, and more traditionally feminine wider hips. This sort of style of art has been discovered, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, fairly recently. I think off the top of my head, I want to say 1920s, Akhenaten sort of sculpture and relief becomes more sort of well known. What's interesting to me is how people have interpreted this figure. We've got scholars going back as far as the 1930s, just before World War II, noting that their first impressions of seeing images of Akhenaten is that this statue looks more feminine than masculine. And I will quote from the article, "This looks like a woman." This isn't a particularly enlightened article. I won't quote the rest of it, but it gets pretty homophobic towards the end. But this is how it starts. It starts with this assessment of ancient Egyptian art. You might think that's odd, but let us not forget that at some points, and I'm talking at some points before sort of Hellenization with Alexander's conquest of Egypt, where we have queens like Cleopatra, that sometimes Egypt was ruled by women. Queens like Hatshepsut ruled directly. They style themselves as king. Not only in art, where they're quite famously depicted wearing false beards, along with a lot of Egyptian pharaohs who either shaved or couldn't grow beards for whatever reason, but also in in inscriptions and literature, they have directly styled themselves as King Hatshepsut, Pharaoh of Egypt, a clear sort of conscious effort to portray themselves as a man. So why would someone who the annals would say was born biologically male, whatever you want to make of that term, we all know that's not really how things work, but let's just go with it for the sake of argument. Born into a more traditionally masculine body, and by all accounts was able to have children, so they weren't infertile. Why depict themselves like this, like a woman? It seems doubtful that a king who had so much power as to move the capital city, disrupt the religious and economic systems within what was, in all honesty, quite a short reign. It seems hard to believe that someone with that sort of power wouldn't have the authority to dictate how they were portrayed in artwork. I put it to you that if these statues were created, it was not only with Akhenaten's permission, but Akhenaten's blessing they were depicted like this. Which is a key point of evidence, because a lot of modern day, I think the term is history of medicine, historical medicine. A lot of doctors, MDs, have decided to analyze the sort of biology of Akhenaten and other 18th dynasty pharaohs, and have come to conclusions that because just like all Egyptian dynasties, the 18th was fairly incestuous, that a lot of dominant traits that would have weeded themselves out have sort of reappeared time and time again in these royal figures. And among those include gynecomastia. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not a doctor. A condition that makes people that are male at birth grow traditionally feminine breasts, which could potentially, you know what, I'm sure that's fine.
Sorry, something fell.
It's okay. Where was I? Could potentially be an answer as to why they, quote unquote, that article again, look like a woman in all these statues. Of course, could also mean they were born intersex, could also mean any number of things. But because they didn't change this, I put it to you that at some level, they were happy enough to be depicted like this. The argument that they weren't queer tends to stem from this medical side, that the medicine proves, quote unquote, proves that they had a condition, and then any sort of symbolic or thematic interpretation is incorrect. I'd like to point out that, again, we're not sure we have Akhenaten's body, and even the bodies we do have, we haven't tested for these genes, this DNA. We can't prove it. We can't prove they had these conditions. We can't prove that other people in the dynasty had these conditions either. So this argument might be completely false, first of all. But even if this is all true, it doesn't mean that they weren't queer, that they didn't identify solely as a man or a woman. Could have been anywhere outside or in between those binaries. We cannot prove it either way. That's what I kept coming back to throughout all my research, going back as far as the 5th dynasty. As much proof as there is for platonic or cisgender or heterosexual answers, there is just as much evidence for a queer narrative or a queer explanation to these real people. So my question is, why do people assume straight? Why do people assume cisgender? I mean, the answer is, I probably fairly obvious that, European society, which has predominantly done a lot of, predominantly taken over excavation in Egypt. And I say excavation, theft is more accurate at times. But it is a lot of Europeans participating in this, and a lot of Europeans sort of holding fast to their traditional beliefs, stemming from a wide variety of sources, that queer people didn't exist, or queer people didn't exist back then. And even if they did, these people that they found, that they sort of idolize as the ancients, couldn't possibly be queer. That must be where it stems from, and must be why they ignore the evidence when there is even the tiniest bit of space for interpretation. So I'd like to put it to everyone to stop assuming that people have to be straight or cisgender. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I assume that maybe at least one other person at some point will hear this and maybe take it to heart. That's all I want. There's just as much proof to say this wasn't the case, and in many cases a queer explanation is simpler. I will refer again way back to these reliefs and ask, in what world is a heterosexual explanation the sort of more obvious, the simpler answer to what this is depicting? If anyone can explain that to me, I'd very much like to hear it, because I'm not sure you can. And I'd like just a second, just flipping between these two, just to really just stop assuming people are straight. I think that's as far as I can get. I've got something. Can we go to the end of the PowerPoint?
This is the end of the PowerPoint.
Yeah. I'd like to end that if we can find this, 2 undergraduate students, and one of whom has only done the barest bit of archaeology in their time, if we can find this in what is a relatively small amount of research compared to the large amounts, proper professional academic scholars can do, if we can find this evidence, anyone can, anyone at all. You don't have to have any knowledge. I don't know how hieroglyphs work. I can't read Egyptian, but I can find this. This is really easy to find. Even the Catullus I quoted earlier, easy to find. Anyone can do it. There is no excuse. I hope you will have a lovely day.
Thank you.